and welcome to another episode of PDA Dad UK. I wanted to talk in this episode basically about my journey into the world of special educational needs and autism, and what led me to become an advocate, if you like, for autism awareness and autism acceptance, which is, I think, a better way to put it. And understanding autism and the fact that it's not this sort of end-of-life thing, but it's actually a door that opens to a greater world for so many people. Part of that is also going to be leading into why I'm a huge proponent for actually speaking with autistic people as a parent of an autistic child. So I'll start with the birth of my daughter, which is really when the whole journey began for me. She was one of those babies that was just totally angelic in her appearance. We actually had people coming into our section of the hospital to see her because she looked like the typical sort of baby doll, if you like. I actually didn't think I'd ever have kids, so my daughter was a total blessing to me in that capacity, and it was like, wow, here we are. I'm actually a dad now. She looked a lot like me. One of the funniest moments was that my wife, when she saw me holding her, said to me, "She looks just like you." She was really grumpy about that. she hoped that she looked more like her, I think. And I think it was the first night home that really was a challenge. And we didn't know any different. And this is the thing. We get into these situations and these life experiences. We don't know what life's going to throw at us, and we often don't know the difference. And the first night home, we didn't get a wink of sleep. And the reason was my daughter was totally needed to be connected to us. The anxiety was already there. We didn't realise that's what it was at the time. The second we tried to put her into her Moses basket or put her down, she'd start crying, she'd start wailing. And obviously at that age you can't co-sleep with a child. There's the danger of rolling on them. And I remember the next morning neither of my wife nor myself had any sleep at all. We were both really haggard, and it was like, what's going on? Nobody told us about this bit, it was a bit of a rude awakening, but we thought that was just part of parenting. There's lots of things people don't tell you about when you have kids, and you learn them as you go, and they're things that people don't think to mention. We just sort of got on with it and worked away about. We basically do shifts. So I'd spend some time up holding my daughter and letting her sleep on me while I stayed awake, and then we'd switch over, usually when she needed a feed or something like that. There were a lot of signs in retrospect. So things that I didn't realise were signs of being autistic or having any kind of neurodiversity that were there as my daughter grew up. She was a runner. So one of the things that she used to do, we used to take her to parks and go places, and she'd grab an opportunity and she'd be gone out the gate of the park, and we'd have to run miles to try and catch up with her. And she's fast. At the time I was a lot bigger. I lost a lot of weight, and so trying to keep up with this sprightly 2-3-year-old as she was bolting off, it was terrifying. She had no sense of danger. She'd happily run out in front of a car, had no sense of self-preservation or safety around her, which many kids don't. That's not necessarily an autistic trait, but it was certainly something that when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you could see that was definitely a facet of her condition and who she is as an autistic person. We had a lot of issues with trying to get her to do anything. She was always demand avoidant. And so, you trying to get things like toys cleaned up and stuff like that. But again, this is just part of parenting. The big awakening for us was probably when she started at nursery. And the nursery immediately picked up on a number of things that were there and spoke to us about it in the form of schemas. So schemas are a really interesting facet of growing up as a child. Most kids will have a schema of some sort or another. So my son, who is a neurotypical boy, he had a schema when he was a toddler, which was that he used to like putting things into boxes. They called it a containing schema. So he always wanted to put things in boxes, and he'd take them out and then he'd put them back in. And schemas are a normal part of toddlerhood. It's a part of the learning process. And it's difficult sometimes because deciphering between schemas and autistic traits can be really difficult because there really is a lot of crossover. One of the questions I see come up a lot on the group that I run on Facebook is this question of, are these autistic traits in my toddler? The problem is that a lot of autistic traits cross over heavily with toddlerisms. So it can be really hard to judge what is autism and what's just being a normal toddler and part of the process of growing up. It's really challenging because, as I say, these things are a normal part of growing up. However, they also form part of autism depending on where they're at developmentally. Developmentally, my daughter was behind in some ways. She was a late speaker. She took a while to walk. Again, these aren't things that are unusual. Some kids just develop these abilities as they grow, and they're just a late developer, if you like, is probably the common term that people would use to describe it. There was a point where it was partly out of the concerns raised by my daughter's nursery, we ended up with speech and language therapy, and basically she had to go into the hospital for some hearing tests. And that was the first time I was really struck by there could be something that's different here. That's not, and my concern was that she was going to be deaf, and they were talking about having a strap with a hearing aid and all that kind of stuff. And for myself, growing up, I was bullied quite a lot. I know it's hard to believe looking at me now, but I was heavily bullied at school, and one of those things that I would never want to see my kids go through. And the thought of her having something different that would be something other kids could target really hit me, and it's the first time I'd been really upset and concerned for her and what her future might hold. And I remember talking to my wife and saying, I just don't want this for her. And it wasn't from a selfish perspective that this could be something that she'd be targeted for, and a struggle that she was obviously going to face. And it really struck me, and I was really, really upset about it. She went in and she did the hearing tests, and they picked up that she wasn't hearing a certain spectrum of sound. So basically the higher pitched sound. The problem was that she had such a low threshold for focus and concentration. She was just bored by the point they got to that. It was the last part of the test. Thankfully, we were allowed to redo it, and what they did was reverse that process. So they did the high pitches first, and it was really interesting to watch. They basically have she knows if there's a sound that's played, they sort of train that the sound is played, something's going to happen behind her that's fun. And it was like a puppet that popped up in a box, and so if she hears the sound and then turns around to check it, that was the signal that she's hearing and responding to certain sounds. So thankfully, I think it was the second or third time we did this, and they said no, she's hearing fine. She's lacking the concentration to be able to get through an entire session of this, and was just fed up. So that led to other referrals, seeing what could possibly be going on. It was a challenging time, but I was just relieved that she wasn't going to have to wear any kind of hearing apparatus or anything like that. I didn't want my child getting picked on. The problems at nursery continued. Her behaviours became more erratic and certainly more aggressive. It led to some ongoing concerns. It was about this time that my wife was being diagnosed with her bipolar disorder. And so there was a lot going on and a lot happening. And it just was a time of real upheaval. We basically got to the point where school started. So she went into reception year, and the school were immediately, there's clearly something going on here. And there were a couple of really obvious things. One was that she was just really, really disruptive in class. And the other one was that she was, a runner. And what she would actually do is run out of the classroom, and they'd all be chasing after him. It was a massive disruption. What they ended up doing was creating a route around the school where they were able to block off certain points. So she'd run around safely, and they'd just wait for her to come back round. But she'd run and run and run to the point that they'd hold her, and her heart would be pounding where she was so het up and pent up and had been running so hard. But she'd have carried on unless they sort of caught her and stopped her. The disruption in class was becoming a real issue. They ended up building a sensory area for her outside the classroom. If she was becoming disruptive, if something was happening, they'd take her out of the classroom and she had this sensory area she could go to. The school at this point had already put in place a one-to-one. So this was before any kind of funding. The school were really proactive and really helpful for us. They'd put a one-to-one in place. So she always had someone with her. It wasn't just a TA, it was an LSA, a learning support assistant. So she was actually able to teach my daughter the things that were needed one-to-one on a more personal level, and had that training to do so with children with special educational needs. At the end of reception year, they basically said, look, there's just no way she's going to handle year one. The shift goes from so much play to more focused learning in year one. So it's a really unusual step, but they repeated my daughter for reception. So she went through reception twice, and toward the end of the second year of reception, they said to us, look, she's not going to handle mainstream school. I think you really need to look at getting her into a special educational needs school, which was confronting. And I think that's the thing. A lot of these things are very, very confronting. We want the best for our kids. We want our kids to be happy. We want them to be successful, lovers of life. And when things get in the way, you start to stress and worry. You start blaming yourself. You go through a whole process of emotions. And it's something I see come up regularly on the group is parents who are just blaming themselves, upset, feel guilty they hadn't seen many of the traits, or they hadn't paid enough attention to them, and now they're in this situation. Why couldn't we act earlier? The problem is you can't always act earlier. The difficulty is toddlerisms and schemas and autistic traits all cross over, and that's why a lot of professionals won't diagnose until kids are over the age of 5 or 7, depending on the area you're in and the professional you're dealing with. It can be very difficult to get an early diagnosis in that way, because these things are often things that are just grown out of, or just kids growing up, and then a normal part of the growing process and the learning process in life. The school were really good, and they basically put in place the next steps, which was to get an EHCP. So in the last episode we talked a lot about the EHCPs and how you go about getting them. I hadn't even heard of an EHCP at this point, so it was all new to me. And it was at this point we were shifting into year one. We'd hoped she'd be in a SEND school by the point that we'd finished the second round of reception for my daughter. But it hadn't worked that way. We had to shift her into a new school. We'd moved, so we needed to get her into the local school, and they were awful. It was really the chalk and cheese situation. We went from a school that were very supportive and understanding, and we actually thought it would be a better school for her. It was a very small school. There were only about 40 students for the whole primary school. And we thought maybe a calmer, quieter environment with less kids might actually be something that helps her. But it was the complete opposite. The mask well and truly dropped, if you like. So we've talked in previous episodes about masking and what happens with masking. Brief roundup of it is that many autistic kids will mask at school, so they appear to be really compliant and the model student, if you like, and then they get home and it explodes. It's like a Coke bottle being shaken up all day, and then when they're in their safe place, which is home, that's when they let it all out, because they feel they can be themselves, their true selves. The mask had well and truly dropped. She couldn't maintain it. The school ended up excluding her. When we started, we were assured there was a no exclusion policy. They wouldn't ever exclude any of their kids, but they were doing it for 3 out of 5 days a week. My daughter would lash out, have an episode, a meltdown, and they'd call us up, "You've got to come and get her. She's suspended for the next 3 days." And that was every week. It really wasn't working. Thankfully, at that point, due to some errors from the 0 to 25s team, who were the group that are responsible in our area for placing kids in education, they basically made some mistakes, and I caught them on it, and they had to quickly cover their butts on the whole situation. And they found a school. The only one they could find was actually a private school, but because she is because she has the extra needs she has, and the fact that they dropped the ball, they basically had to place her. So They placed her into a special educational needs school, and it has been an absolute godsend for us. The difference between a school that doesn't understand special educational needs and a school that does is unbelievable. It had such a huge impact on my daughter and her learning process. They don't use traditional learning techniques. They do a lot of outdoor learning, so they take them outside. And so forest school is a great example. She has once a week she goes to forest school. They're doing a farm school starting up soon as well. But the idea is that she goes out and it's like, right, we need to go and collect 10 sticks. I want you to collect 5 of these. Now, how many have you got there? That's 15. And so using the environment around them to teach them these things that they weren't learning she wasn't learning in mainstream education. They didn't remove her from class unnecessarily. They actually have breakout rooms at her school. So she's able to go from, if she's having an issue in school, she gets taken out into one of the breakout rooms, and they've got 2 types. One is a sensory room, so it's got all the sort of sensory bits and pieces in there, the lights and the stuff. And the others are white rooms, which are just empty except for a chair. And what they realised was that my daughter was starting to act out in class because she loved the sensory room. So she'd go out and play in the sensory room and having a ball. So that was taken off the table basically, and she had to go into the empty room, and she very quickly, and that's what decided, no, this sucks, I don't want to be in here. And she'd go back into class very smoothly from there and bring herself back down. About this time, I started to be aware of the fact that obviously there's autism involved here. So a CAMS worker basically told me this is autism, and it's actually what's called pathological demand avoidance, PDA, and you won't get that diagnosed. So our local area doesn't diagnose PDA. They will diagnose the autism, but they don't diagnose PDA, which is the case in many areas in the UK. That really helped. Once I knew PDA was in the picture, I was able to start researching it. And because of her age, we were starting to go out into soft plays and stuff like that. And often she'd act out, there'd be a problem, and I'd have to apologise to a parent here or a parent there and explain, sorry, she's autistic and she has these issues. She finds it hard to regulate her emotions. And out of that, I found so many people who, oh, well, I've got a cousin who's autistic, or I have a niece, or I have my sister or my son or my daughter are autistic also. And I got into some really good conversations with these people and ended up making friends with a great deal of them. And one of the things that seems to happen to a lot of parents, once they've identified that their child is autistic, they start to see autistic traits in themselves. And so they've sort of diagnosed later in life because their kids have been diagnosed. And I've got a number of friends who are in this situation, realised they were autistic, became, either got diagnosed or just are aware of it now and work with it. And it's a massive thing and an absolute godsend to me. I was able to talk to actually autistic people and understand as much as it's possible for someone who doesn't experience these things myself, able to understand what's going on in my daughter's head to a much deeper degree. A great example of that, and I've done a video on it before, was the hearing voices. So my daughter came to me and she'd thrown a plate against a wall, and it was, why did you do that? Dinner it was this wall right here. There was dinner running behind it. It's a spaghetti bolognese, as you can imagine. It wasn't great. It was all sliding down the wall. And what caused that? There was no trigger. There was no reason for her to have done it. And she said, well, that's what the voice said to do. My wife, as I say, she's got what's called bipolar affective disorder. So I was immediately on the voice thing. I was like, oh, okay, that's not good. Maybe that's what we're dealing with here. Maybe there's this bipolar affective disorder in the mix as well. And I was talking to my autistic friends about it and saying, I'm really worried because that, where does that come from? And there was 2 of them who were in the conversation, and they were both, well, yeah, we get that. And I was, excuse me? There's no, the voices are really common. And they were able to explain to me, it's like, for me, I have this internal dialogue that goes on in my head. I talk to myself, I think things. And you might think, it'd be funny if that was just against the wall, wouldn't it? And what would happen to the spaghetti? For my daughter, it becomes a separate voice saying, hey, you should do that. It's just the way the autistic brain interprets that internal dialogue and it makes it a separate voice rather than being what I'm aware is my own thoughts. And they're very, very hard to resist. They can be very compulsive. And so that's what led to this. Understanding that was just an absolute blessing to me, being able to talk to autistic people. With one of these ladies that were helping me like this, we started a group. In fact, the three of us actually started the group on Facebook, which was basically about helping people get through, helping people get through the diagnosis process in the UK, because it's just such a challenging thing to do in the UK. The diagnosis process is very long, very drawn out, and there's a lot of fighting involved. You have to really push to get an official diagnosis. And that group really took off, and it was sort of a snowball effect. It starts off slow, and then more and more people were joining, and it's sort of fallen to me to run it now. And we've got over 23,000 members of these people in the UK who are experiencing these same pitfalls. And we did a really interesting, when we hit the 20,000 member mark, I made a video for the group. I asked people to write comments about anything that they'd found helpful or that the group had helped them with. And some people made video clips for it to splice in there as well. And I was blown away that one of the things that was just almost every single message I got was, I no longer feel alone. I don't feel as alone anymore. I felt very alone, and this group has helped me find people that are in the same boat as me. It was this not alone, not alone, not alone. And I ended up calling the video Not Alone. And it really struck me that that's what so many of us face. Special educational needs as a parent really isolate you. And I find it a struggle sometimes. The problem is that, and I get it, for other people, it can be a real challenge to be with kids who have behavioural issues, so challenging behaviours. If you don't have to live and deal with that, then, why would you put yourself through it? And it's really isolating, and I've probably had some of the loneliest times of my life as a result of the fact that you lose the friends that would have been just friends, and your kids playing together and you're having a coffee and a laugh in the garden or at a soft play or at a park or whatever. They're gone. You're put into the too hard basket, and I get it and I understand it. But as a parent, as a human, and as a sociable human, I need my friendships, and I find that really isolating. And as a result of that, finding people who are themselves actually autistic. We have a number of moderators on my group who are autistic themselves. I have a number of friends who are autistic themselves, and one of the biggest sources of wisdom for me, one of the richest sources of information, comes from these autistic people. And you realise that they're not Rain Man. General perception of autism outside of those who understand it is this very severe form of autism, and that's not what it's like. These people are just people. They're human beings, and they're awesome human beings. And I've been more inspired by the actually autistic people who are around me than almost anyone. These are people who have extra battles to face, extra hurdles that they have to cross in order to achieve. But in so many cases, they've used their autistic traits as skill sets. Hyperfocus is a really good example. Being able to actually focus in on something and block everything else around you means that you can do things. So I interviewed my friend Emily from Arty Bohemian, and her stuff's amazing, and she's able to do what she does because she's autistic. She's not hindered by it due to autism. She's able to do a lot of this stuff because she's autistic. She sees the world a certain way because she's autistic. I was able to talk to Sophie Lavender during last week for my podcast, Grumpy Dads, and we were interviewing Sophie, who is an autistic comedian and photographer and does a whole load of stuff on social media. And the things that she does, she said herself, the comedy comes because so often the best comedy comes from being able to look at life from a slightly different perspective and move with it. And that's what she does. And she's able to talk about life from that different perspective because that's just her normal perspective. Autism is challenging. The biggest thing I can say is it's not the end of the world, and it can feel like that. We all want our kids to be as happy and healthy and successful as they can be. Understanding autism, talking to autistic people, knowing as much as you can really does help you to help your kids. It helped me to help my daughter. It helps me to help her understand who she is, and it helps me to understand who she is myself so I can better support her. She's going to be amazingly successful. The things that are often frustrating now and the challenging behaviours, refusal to accept no as an answer, the determination to see something through because she just wants to do that no matter what people are telling her to say she can't do that, she will do it regardless. These are all things that are going to be massively helpful in future life. They're things that are going to mean that when everyone else is saying you can't do that, business doesn't work that way, she's going to go, well, I'm going to do it. She's going to be very successful. She's going to be somebody who makes a difference. Get involved in the SEN world. Get onto Special Educational Needs Twitter, get onto Facebook groups, not just my group, any group, find the one that suits you. Engage with other parents, engage with other autistic people. And it is such a rich world, and it's a world that I would not have been exposed to and wouldn't have benefited from the way I have had I not had autism thrust into my life in the way it has been. And I'm really, really thankful for that. That's all I really want to say. Thank you so much for spending the time. I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to hear, if you're autistic yourself, I'd love to hear tips and tricks that you found to get through life, to make yourself a success. I want to hear about your successes. Please do leave it in the comments. Please do subscribe to my channel. Please do share it, and I will see you next week.